Modern games suck. Everything was better back in the olden days. I had way more fun playing games when I was younger. All things you might hear or read on the internet, but is it true? Are older games actually better than modern games? Are they the masterpieces some people make them out to be? Or do we look at a pile of steaming shit through rose tinted glasses? Let's find out. First we need to define old games, so that we're on the same page. Old games to me are from the 8-bit and 16-bit era. And to get straight to the point, while I absolutely love playing these old games, I personally don't think they are better than modern games. So why is it that people think older games are better? A huge part of why some people think older games are better is pure nostalgia. We think back of our childhoods, we sat in awe and wonder behind our Nintendo, Atari or Commodore 64. The glow of a CRT screen and our imagination ran wild when playing Pitfall or Moon Patrol. The lack of detailed graphics was simply replaced by our imagination. It was more like reading a book, where you create the entire world the book describes in your head. Even the characters had faces and voices we make up. It is the same for these old video games with very primitive graphics. We probably also fondly remember playing games with a friend. I still remember playing volleyball on the Atari 2600 together with a friend in his attic on a black and white television. Or international soccer on the Commodore 64 with my nephew, being way too fanatic trying to win. But was it because these games were so great? I think above all else it was the nostalgia factor. The novelty of simply playing a video game at all, the world we created in our minds, and the friends we played them with is what we remember so fondly. But I mean, just look at it. Is this really better than modern FIFA?
Against Bayern Munich.
Well, thanks, Derek. The best coach I've played.
Kane! And a goal! 1-0, and what a...
Besides the nostalgia factor, one reason people say older games are better is gameplay. And yes, the gameplay of older games is certainly different than modern games. Older games, especially from the 8-bit era like the Atari 2600, Nintendo Entertainment System or Commodore 64, are very much limited by the hardware they run on. I mean, the Atari 2600 had 120 bytes of RAM, while the NES had a whopping 4 kilobytes of video and system memory combined. To put that into context, 16 gigabytes of RAM is 4 million times more RAM than the NES had to work with, and 125 million times more than the Atari 2600 had. CPUs weren't much better either. The Commodore 64 had a 1 MHz CPU, which is slower than the CPU in most dishwashers these days. So game creators had to compensate somewhere. They couldn't create complex game mechanics and graphics were limited. So they used time limits, trial and error, and having to remember certain patterns. And they upped the difficulty level to over 9000. All to compensate for the lack of levels or gameplay area. Some games were so extremely unforgiving that they are downright impossible. Like Aztec Challenge here, for example. The moment you start the game, you get killed, and you have to have the reflexes of the Greek god Hermes to dodge or jump over the spears. And this is just the first level, and believe me, it gets even more insane. Boss fights in older games are also notorious for having to remember patterns instead of simply being good. Older games require quick reflexes, force you to remember patterns and are usually a lot of trial and error. Magazines like Nintendo Power owed their entire existence on the way old games worked. No one in their right mind would know that you needed to burn a specific isolated tree or bush in Zelda, and you wouldn't find your way out of a labyrinth without a map. Games back then were really something else. But was that really better? Or was it just infuriating at times? The dopamine hit for finally beating a boss or finishing in time was real though, and the simple game mechanics made it so you would come back for more. They are a classic case of easy to learn, hard to master. And while the challenge can be good fun, they also can be unforgiving. Some games were in fact so brutally hard that they are simply not that much fun to play. There are of course a lot of well-balanced games, especially in the 16-bit era, but they still can be very frustrating to play and you really have to commit to finish these games. Even these days, I still can't finish some games easily or at all due to the sheer difficulty. And I've been playing them for over 40 years now. A lot of games also couldn't be finished in the normal amount of time, and since you have to finish them in one go, as there were no or very limited save options, leaving your console on overnight was actually quite a normal thing to do. Gameplay wise, older games were challenging and very different. But better? I don't think so. Graphics are a mixed bag. Obviously, games on systems like the Atari 2600 or Commodore 64 look like a pixelated pile of donkey poo compared to modern games. Which is not to say the games can still be fun, but purely from an aesthetic point of view, it is no context. Grid racing simply looks and plays a lot better than Pole Position 2 on the Commodore 64. And I would rather fool around and play with the physics engine in BeamNG Drive than to play Stunt Car Racer on the Commodore 64, which, to be fair, is impressive for the hardware. But it's still a game where the racetrack is a wireframe being rendered at 5 FPS. I know what I'd rather play. If we go onto the 16-bit era, things change significantly. Not only do those graphics have a certain charm to them, they actually still hold up. Where a kid these days probably would want to play Atari 2600 or Commodore 64 games due to the graphics, they almost certainly would want to play 16-bit games. If their attention span is long enough, that is. The graphics of the 16-bit games are in fact so much beloved that there are a ton of modern games made in the same style, like Shovel Knight and other pixel art games. With the limitations of the hardware in mind, some games on older systems look downright impressive. But they don't look better than modern games, not even close. Music is one area that old games definitely excelled in. Games like Streets of Rage, Sonic the Hedgehog and Castlevania had some of the most amazing soundtracks ever created, and have been an inspiration for tons of people around the world, covering the songs with real instruments or even having a complete concert based on music from these old video games. What is better, multiplayer or multiplayer? Yes, even before the internet and local networks, we had multiplayer games. You invited a friend over, sat next to each other and played using split screen or turn-based against each other. Modern multiplayer is of course way different, as almost all of it's online multiplayer. The advantage is that you don't have to have any friends. You can always find someone to play with online. Another advantage of modern multiplayer is that you can play with others wherever and whenever you want. But of course, it comes with downsides. Not only do you miss out on a good time hanging out with your friends in real life, but you're also completely dependent on the video game maker to keep the online service alive, to be able to play the game with others, or at all. The same can be said for older games. I can still play international soccer on the Commodore 64 with my nephew if I wanted to, even though the game is now 43 years old. As long as you have the hardware and 2 joysticks, you can play the game together. So where do older games and modern games excel in? Where older games draw you in with the easy to learn, hard to master concept, which will make you come back for more, to try it one last time, modern games rely on way better graphics and more complex game mechanics. Online shooters with multiple weapons and attachments where you get to shoot others in a vast open world simply aren't a thing on older consoles, and I love playing those. And what about fast open worlds and complete player freedom you have in games like GTA or PUBG? That was simply inconceivable back in the day. So are older games better? In some ways, yes. The gameplay, while difficult, can be very rewarding, and some of the most epic and most recognizable game soundtracks are from older games. Older games also don't suffer from planned obsolescence, DRM, and multiplayer that will one day end, making some games that rely on multiplayer completely unplayable. But when it comes to graphics, game mechanics, complexity, player freedom, physics, and open worlds, modern games can't be beat. And while I do love playing older games, I recognize a big part of it is nostalgia. And I'm more than happy to play modern games, and I wouldn't want to live without them anymore. So are older games better? No. Are they worse? Also no. They're just different, and they deserve the same love modern games do. Just like modern games deserve love too. So what do you think? Do you think older games are better? And if so, in what way? Thanks as always for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.